him and Eric have been the talk of the town here. This was interesting to me, Jeremy, because I feel like I haven't seen something go so viral within kind of the Lions beat writer community. It was like you guys all united, and because I follow all you guys, and I have the majority of you on the show as much as I can, and it was neat to see everybody kind of routing everything through that interview and saying, hey, didn't matter who it was, Justin Rogers, Jeff Risdon, guys that maybe work for other publications, they were saying, hey, you got to go check this interview out because it was kind of the first major availability and you guys cracked open a nice interview. So I have to imagine you've been getting a lot of feedback here recently.
Yeah, no doubt. It was a really cool opportunity to be one of the first people to talk to new Lions offensive coordinator Drew Petzing. The timing was perfect because it was kind of a downtime where we're right before the combine. We're kind of right after all of the coaching news has kind of dried up for most teams, and so it's a really cool opportunity for us. I know the Lions were probably pretty happy with how everything went, considering how all the awesome feedback that we got about not only how we did, but how Drew kind of presented himself for us for a good 30 minutes. So, yeah, it was a really fun, neat opportunity that I'm glad we got to do.
Oh, it was a home run for sure. I enjoyed it. And it's funny to me because we were trying to decide with now having a football only show here with Shayne. I was trying to decide what to do. And we do an interview series. That'll be the next interview after you, where we bring on a former player and kind of talk to them about their career and go in depth, kind of like your interview that you had. And It's funny because even though I know football is a year-round thing, I remember thinking, well, okay, is there going to be some weeks where it's like, well, there's really nothing happening? And that really hasn't happened yet. It's you're more familiar with covering the beat year-round, but it is funny. It's even evolved in the time that you've been on the beat of how year-round football is, because there really isn't a break. I had a buddy of mine tell me after the Super Bowl finished, I'm glad the season is finished because now we can focus on the offseason and the draft. And I'm like, isn't the goal the season? Isn't that what we want to cover? But people get excited for the offseason too. And I think you could see that kind of with this interview.
Yeah, no doubt. And I mean, it's everything. It's the coaching cycle, which was obviously pretty crazy this year with 10, I think it was, new head coaches. Salary cap stuff is becoming bigger and bigger as the public becomes kind of more aware of ways that you can manipulate the cap. People get excited about the combine, obviously, but before that, there's the East-West Shrine game, there's the Senior Bowl. And so, yeah, really, for people that do love the offseason, there's really no break in between the regular season and the offseason. There's stuff for you right there. I mean, the Senior Bowl and East-West Shrine game happened before the Super Bowl even happened. So there's some overlap there as well.
Exactly. And that stuff is fun because, I mean, you can see kind of the evolution of things. I mean, we even saw it kind of in Isaac Tesla's journey because I ended up interviewing him before the draft last year on our other show. Yeah. To me, it seemed like an easy comp to go, hey, you're from Michigan, you're from this area, you really scream a Detroit Lions player. And then after he got drafted, it was like, oh, wow, that was a great prediction. It's like, well, was it really? I mean, it's kind of an obvious thing. But it was interesting to watch his journey through those things because even though he did tear up the combine, he had to have several steps before he even got to that point. And so to be able to follow those guys through the process can be very satisfying for both the fan and the player and the person that's covering them.
Yeah, no doubt. And I kind of had that experience last year when I went to the combine for the first time. I was just kind of, I didn't have a specific target on, one of the finals days I was there when the offensive linemen were speaking, but naturally a lot of people were drawn to Tate Ratledge kind of just to, superficially because how he looks out there with the big mullet and the big mustache. And, I dropped into that media session, asked a question, got a really good answer, and lo and behold, I ended up using it a few times after the Lions drafted him. And it's kind of the fun part of the process. It can be frustrating, too, because you can probably put in a bunch of work, interview 50 people, and none of them get drafted by the player the team you're covering. But it's all, I guess, part of the fun. But yeah, it's a long off season. You cover a lot of stuff, and you kind of cross your fingers that something like that happens and hits, and something that you can draw back on once the draft is over.
Exactly, a good callback. That's always good. It's good for comedy, and it's good for
Exactly.
for being a beat writer. But I'm curious I wanted to kind of get a behind the scenes a little bit, because one of the things that I really enjoyed, I follow all of your stuff as you know, and I follow the regular Pride of Detroit stuff, and then I'm also on the direct, which we'll be recommending to people at the end of the interview. But I saw you do kind of an anatomy of an interview piece with that Petsing piece, and I thought that was really interesting, because as somebody that also tries to craft interviews for my two shows weekly, there is an art to it, and it's kind of a combination of art and science, and I thought you guys did a good job, especially with being on a video call. That can make it more complicated. You had two people asking questions, and then you've got to be able to roll with how the person is, and I thought Petsing was a good interviewee from a lot of standpoints, but that's also credit has to go to the interviewer for that as well. But I'm curious kind of how you felt about everything, and what those behind the scenes things looked like for you guys.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that, first of all. But yeah, we were pretty sure that something was going to happen about 2 or 3 weeks out, and so from that point on, Eric and I started kind of formulating a basic outline of what that interview would look like. We wanted to make sure that we were keeping the conversation somewhat light, because that's kind of our brand. We're fans of the team, and so we want to make sure that this is still a fun thing for people to experience. But knowing that we might be the first person to talk to them in the Lions media, we also knew like this was an opportunity to really break some news and get some information out there that isn't out there. And so we wanted to make sure we stayed true to our own voice, while also kind of maintaining our journalistic duty of getting good information out there. But beyond that, like you said, you never know how an interview is going to go. You could get long-winded answers and only fit in 5 questions in a 20-minute span, or you might get one-sentence answers. So you wanted to make sure, one, that you had enough questions, but to kind of like mitigate that, both Eric and I went and watched some of his past interviews and tried to figure out how he is with certain questions, how he is with just general answers. And so we wanted to just kind of prepare ourselves for both situations. But we had a pretty good feeling that he was going to give some pretty thorough answers, be pretty, have a good character to him. And so we could keep things light and fun, and he would kind of join in on it. And all of that kind of turned out to be true, thankfully, and things flowed generally quite well. Eric and I made sure to pick out some of the wordings to make sure we weren't asking things in either disrespectful or in a, the thing that always I try to be very cognizant of is not answering the question for them and saying, something like, okay, you've got all these weapons. How good is it your offense going to be when you have all these weapons? And, I already put the word good in there for him, he doesn't really have anything left to say. So you always have to make sure that the diction is very precise sometimes with interviews like that. So we wanted to make sure we got that right. And then last of all, the cool thing about the interview is that the Lions really encouraged us to get the fans involved too. And so there was, we only could announce it 48 hours in advance just to make sure the schedules were right. So we didn't have a ton of time to curate a bunch of questions, but we found the best ones that we thought were going to fit what we were trying to do. And we may have tweak the wording here and there just to make sure, again, we were getting the best answers we could. But overall, I would say the process took 2-3 weeks just to kind of perfect. And I think I was very happy with how it all turned out.
As somebody that generally refuses to take call-ins, it's a bold move. I'm impressed because because for the reasons that you mentioned, having to reword things and curate it a little bit, that's definitely something that every fan thinks they've got the best question and a good question. But yeah, you guys were rolling and you guys had a good interview. I'm curious what the takeaways that you had were. I know I watched some of it afterwards to see your thoughts. I watched the full video, but I know you covered it a little bit then, but you had to come away pretty impressed with the guy, because I guess I never understood. I don't know how your opinion changed over time, Jeremy, but I never understood the initial backlash, and then it was like they had to hire Kafka, and then they went, oh, okay, I guess we're okay with this now. And now, thanks to your interview and people seeing him a little bit more, I think the tide is rising for him. But boy, there were some fans that didn't give him much of a chance right off the bat.
Yeah, and I think part of that was just it was unfortunate timing, because the Lions had just spent the entire week hyping up Mike McDaniel as a hire, hyping up even Kafka as a possible hire, and then when the hiring is announced, it's a guy that we didn't even know was interviewing for the job. In my opinion, if we had heard a week before that he had interviewed when he actually did interview, people would have been able to dig deep on him and have more of an informed opinion on him. But when you hear a name that you hadn't heard in the discussion at all, it's like, who is this guy? Why are we hiring a guy I've never heard of? And so I understand the backlash, but I also think it probably could have been avoidable had someone leaked the fact that he was interviewing a week before. But in terms of the interview, I mean, the overwhelming response has been exactly what you just said. Like, I was nervous about this guy before, but he's smart. He's affable. He can talk ball. He has good answers for everything. And I totally agree. I was very impressed with the way he had really good, quick answers for everything. A lot of people are comparing him, obviously, to the last offensive coordinator, John Morton, who wasn't as good with the media. He wasn't a fast talker. He didn't really treat his media obligations as something he enjoyed doing, and that's his prerogative. That doesn't make him a bad offensive coordinator. But for Lions fans looking for a personality change, maybe a communicator change, I think you're getting all of that in Petzing. Not to mention, I think, the actual content of his answers I thought was impressive, and maybe the biggest takeaway I had was him continuing kind of throughout the interview, not necessarily intentionally, but talking about how he not only lives by the idea of fitting his offense to his players, but he's actually gone through and done that a few times in his career, whether it was kind of moving away from some wide zone early in his career when he thought that was what they were going to do in Arizona, to this past year when injuries forced them to kind of abandon the running game in a way that they certainly didn't want to do. But when you're down to your fourth running back and your 12th offensive lineman and your sixth tight end, you don't really have much of a choice in the matter. And so it's just kind of interesting to see him admit that, they had to make some pretty significant schematic changes while he was there, in ways that he didn't really suspect going into and not necessarily even wanted to, but knew that it was kind of his duty as offensive coordinator to switch things out significantly.
Exactly. The player focus was very clear, and the fact that he can evolve with the game and with the players that he's given, because that's, I guess, why I was a little bit more hopeful. There's probably two reasons. One, you had to look at the reason. I think some people were looking at the rankings and things of the offenses that he was working with, but you also have to look at the personnel too. I'm not trying to bury anybody, but that provides context to everything. But the other thing with me is I was very vocal right out of the gate against McDaniel, and I think I was in the minority, but it wasn't even that. It's not that I didn't think he would do a good job. I think there was a combination of elements where you have the idea that, okay, I don't see how McDaniel works with the team for longer than like 2-ish years, because if he does well, he then is able to get a head coaching job, which is clearly a motivation of his. And so then he's off to another team and you're beginning your offensive coordinator search again, or you realize this is not a good fit. Maybe he's not a culture fit with Dan Campbell, which I theorized at the beginning of the search too, and you have to move on like you did for Morton, and then you're starting over. I really didn't see a scenario in which that extended much beyond a year or two, no matter how it went.
Yeah, I think that there's legitimacy to that, and I think that was something that Dan Campbell maybe kind of unintentionally brought up as something that he might be concerned about in his end of season press conference, when he mentioned something like that, like, if I'm just going to have a guy for a year, maybe what's the point? But we are also living in an offensive league where young offensive minds are going to be found and picked apart no matter what their resume is. If Petzing comes in here and produces the number one offense in his first year in 2026, I imagine he'll probably have some head coaching interviews and some opportunities. Certainly if he does it 2 years in a row. I think there's some stat out there where there are only like 2 or 3, I think, offensive coordinators play calling offensive coordinators who are still with the same team, 2 or 3 years later. There's a really high turnover rate. If you're a good offensive play caller, then you're going to be in high demand. And if you're not, then the team will be on the look for the next one. So I think there's certainly some validity to that, but I also know that if Drew Petzing knocks this job out of the park, he's not probably going to be here for very long either.
Oh yeah, I'm fully aware that could be true for him. His curve might be, the arc might be a little bit more steep, but yeah, the same thing happened for Johnson. He didn't really come in with a lot of experience. Petzing has more experience than he did with actual play calling, so he didn't have as much of a resume and still worked his way up in short time because he was very good at what he did and deserved a promotion. But yeah, it's interesting stuff. I'm glad we could talk about him. We're going to take a quick break and then talk about the player side of things and how you kind of see this playing out with the next steps of the offseason. So we'll come back with Jeremy Reisman of Pride of Detroit after the break. Stick with us. You're listening to Shayne Graham's Extra Points on Jethro FM. Happy to bring back Jeremy Reisman here talking about the Lions offseason. We covered the offensive coordinator interview here with Petzing, and wanted to get your thoughts, Jeremy, on kind of the situation moving forward, because you had a good article on Pride of Detroit about kind of some potential cap casualties. And I've talked about this before on the show, and you've seen this evolution better than most as far as with the Lions as a whole. The position that they're in has changed based on their success. It's a little different when they're 0-16 or they're going through those down years. Your priorities change with, okay, you're focused on the draft, you're trying to hire the new coaches, you're trying to find the players that get cut from other teams. Now they're a team that is at the higher end of their conference and division and the league as a whole. And so the math kind of changes in the offseason. So now we're getting to the point where there might be some cap casualties, might be some players to move on from, but they still have to shore up some positions. So I thought that was an interesting article talking about the possible cap casualties. Glasgow's kind of the main one that you talked about in there, but you had the percentage of Decker being cut pretty low. So I'm curious what you kind of foresee happening with that Decker situation, because I feel like that's the domino that has to fall fairly quickly so that they can plan accordingly and not have another Ragnow situation this year, because they're still catching up from that.
Yeah, no doubt. Obviously, the main question there is retirement or not with Decker. And yeah, I think the Lions are probably going to be a little bit more proactive in trying to get a decision out of Decker. I mean, obviously, ideally by free agency, if not by the draft, last case scenario there, because obviously when Ragnow retired, it was beyond the draft. And I'm sure the Lions had some idea it was eventually coming down the pike, but maybe not that quickly. So, yeah, I don't see a scenario in which the Lions, a very rare, I guess, possible scenario in which the Lions decide, well, we haven't gotten an answer by Decker, but we need to take kind of things into our own hand where we're going to cut them and just save the, $11+ million that they're going to have so that they can be proactive and find a new left tackle for the future, whether it's a Band-Aid this year or a draft pick, a high investment in a draft pick. They got to do something there. And I think they kind of have to do something regardless of what Decker's answer is. But I think the far more likely scenario is that Decker will play ball. He'll make his decision when he's comfortable, and hopefully that's in the next month or so that the Lions can make an informed move in free agency. But, there's never been bad blood between Decker and this organization, or really any regime within this organization. He's always been a very honest and understandable, understands the entire process of the NFL, understands the finances of it, the football side of it. So if there's any resolution to this, I think it's either he decides to retire or the Lions ride with him. He does carry a $21 billion cap hit, which is high for a 30-plus-year-old offensive tackle. But for left tackle, it's actually, I believe it's 12th or 14th or something in that range. So it's not outstanding for his position, and he still is an above-average player. It's just a matter of whether he can withstand another season given his shoulder injuries in the past, and whether he wants to do it, given that I know he's very much a family man and understands the sacrifice he's making being away from family every time he enters an NFL season. So, I if I had to put a guess on it, I think he does probably call it quits, just because anytime you've been talking about it for that long, you've kind of already made that decision, it seems like. But yeah, and the good news for the Lions is that you get the exact same cap space in return that you would if you do cut him. It's just a matter of when that decision is going to come down, and I that's the thing I can't even possibly try to predict, because that's trying to get inside a man's head, and I can't do that.
Exactly. There's a big human element to this side of things, because you guys do a good job of covering that side and humanizing the players, and we try to do that on this show. Obviously, having a former player on the show, the idea that there's a lot involved in this. It's not just transactions. It's not just assets being moved around. Yes, you can call players assets when you're talking about the draft and things like that, but they're more than assets. They're human beings that have the same needs that we do. I talked about this on the hockey side of things this year, because I know people were getting impatient with a guy like John Gibson coming in and not necessarily starting out real strong. But one of the things that I brought up with that, it's true for everybody. It's like, well, if you moved across the country and moved your family and had to find new schools for your kids and had to do all of this stuff, that would probably be a lot of work. Okay, yes, you have more resources, but it doesn't necessarily change the fact that you still have to do all the logistics that go into that. And it's the same thing with a guy that, because now we're talking about that on the opposite end with Decker, where he's got to consider retirement at an age where none of the rest of us would normally consider retirement. I'm way past him as far as retirement, so I guess I should be retired, Jeremy. I guess I got to retire on air here, because it is harder. That's why you see something like what happened last year with Ragnow. He retired because he felt that way in his body, but then most former players that I've talked with have also said they end up missing the camaraderie and the team nature of the game. So it is a tough move to decide, I'm going to call it quits, and I know I won't be able to have that for the rest of my life. Not that same environment. You might be able to work, you might be able to go into coaching or different things, but it's going to be hard to replicate that environment, and it's a very fixed amount of time that you can have it.
Yeah, no doubt. And even with Ragnow, I mean, we talked to a bunch of offensive linemen all year after he retired, and the overwhelming sense was that guy is gone and he's never coming back. He's very comfortable in retirement. He's very comfortable out in his boat and fishing and dealing with his new kids and all that. And lo and behold, everything you just said, it's very clear, even though he never spoke publicly about his intentions on returning, very clear that I think he missed the camaraderie, he missed the competition, and it's hard to make that decision in just a couple months, right? It took Ragnow 6 months, and he went back on it. If we're asking Decker to make that decision by the league opening in early March, you're essentially only giving him 2 months to make that decision after the season ended, and that's not something that's easy. It's not something that he's probably going to be able to make a fully informed decision, because I think a lot of his decision is going to be based on how he believes his shoulder is going to feel by the time the season comes around, and the season's not going to come around for another 4 or 5 months when training camp rolls around, and he's not going to know what his shoulder exactly is going to feel like then. So it's going to be a tough go for Decker, and he could always certainly change his mind, but I'm sure that the Lions would appreciate as much of a clear conscience as he can have possibly in the next month or so.
As you said, Jeremy, especially by free agency, because obviously you do have the draft component, but I don't know that I see the draft component being heavily impacted by the retirement. I think they'll still want a young tackle, as you mentioned, in the draft, and they do kind of go best player available to a degree. So I'm sure they're scouting a lot of those guys. It's just whether or not they're going to pick up somebody that probably is a little bit of a stopgap, because I assume they're going to do the same thing with center, because they basically have the same issue dating back to last year. They're going to have to do something there. That's assuming, because again, we got all these crossed lines here. That's assuming Glasgow gets cut and you had him at a much higher likelihood, but you got to think they maybe move on from him. But if they do, I could see it being a kind of a combination of either trading for a guy that needs to be cleared out from another team, or signing a value free agent. I don't want to get people's hopes up, because I don't think the Linderbaum / McGovern thing is as likely here with them. Who knows? None of us know, but it's just not as likely. That's where the fans' heads go to automatically in kind of the dream scenario, but it's probably not as likely for the cap reasons.
Yeah, exactly. I'm with you. I think it makes most sense if you're the Lions to make sure you have starting capable players at left tackle and at center before you even get to the draft. Whether that is, a stopgap 1-year deal with a, medium to good player, or like you said, maybe you're exploring the trade market a little bit to get kind of those short-term answers. And then, I think center and left tackle are very much on the table at the draft, no matter what happens with Graham, no matter what happens with Taylor Decker. It's not a situation where like you want to put yourself in where you have to get a starting left tackle, you have to get a starting center, which is why you make those free agency or trade moves. But those are whatever you do in free agency and via the trade market, you're probably not set at those positions in the long term, which just puts them on the table. You don't want to force it if your guy isn't there when you're on the clock, but at the same time, the Lions aren't going to sit back and be passive when it comes to their offensive line either. They made that pretty darn clear at the end of the season. We know how much that position in general means to how the entire team operates, both offense and defense. So I wouldn't expect them to be passive necessarily, which is why I expect them to probably make moves both in free agency and the draft. But again, you just can't force it in the draft if it's not there.
Exactly. And I mean, there is difference in availability with some of these positions, because center wise, there's not anybody, there's a lot to be seen, especially with the combine, but there's not really anybody with a first round grade right now at center by most of the services. And so you are looking at more of a developmental guy at that position. Whereas tackle, there is kind of an abundance there. It depends on where these guys get graded, but there does seem to be a little bit of a wealth at tackle. Obviously, you could have guys move inside. You could have right tackle, left tackle stuff, but with Sewell in the mix, you could switch them over. But it does seem, at least in the early going, from following you guys and a lot of the other folks, that a lot of the young tackles are looking pretty good in this draft.
Yeah, I'm kind of still doing my own preliminary research there, but it's certainly, there seems to be at least a little bit of a consensus there that even, deep into maybe the second round, you could find a starting level talent there at tackle. And that's usually one of those positions, especially left tackle, where you usually don't want to really wait until outside the top 20 to get your starting left tackle, because, the odds of getting a starting capable player at one of the most important offensive positions is pretty low. But it sounds like, that maybe it's not a pure left tackle. Maybe you're expecting some right tackles to play left tackle, or in the Lions situation, you have Penei Sewell, who they would be perfectly confident in moving to left tackle if they needed to, if they like the guy that was maybe a little bit better of a right tackle. So they'll certainly have options, especially, maybe if one of those top 2-3 options isn't there at 17. They don't necessarily have to force it at 17. They could wait until, pick, I think it is 50 that they have. So, yeah, they'll certainly have options there. Knowing Brad Holmes, he'll probably be very picky about which particular guy he likes, and if that guy's not there, maybe they don't pick one this year. But like I said, I don't think they're going to sit back and ignore the position either. If Brad has a guy that he really likes, I wouldn't even put it past him, even though they're a little bit scant on draft capital this year, to maybe even trade up a couple spots and get the guy that he really likes, because they aren't going to cut corners when it comes to the offensive line.
Oh yeah, and we've seen his level of aggression before, so that's the more likely scenario here. And I think they are going to be aggressive, not necessarily with capital in free agency, but with making moves and adding bodies in there that they think will be a fit here. But we appreciate you joining the show and talking over the offseason and the interview. Be sure to tell people where they can follow you here with Pride of Detroit Direct and all the great things that you guys are doing.
Yeah, well, you can follow me on social media, Detroit on Lion, but you can get all of our content over on prideofdetroit.com. If you want to see our interviews, podcasts, things like that, you can just search for Pride of Detroit on YouTube or Twitch. We live stream on both platforms. And then, we have a whole bunch of premium content that includes guest writers that we really love, Brent Whitefield, Ty Shelter, really impressive guys. We have exclusive podcasts, and that's over on, like you said, Pride of Detroit Direct, which you can subscribe to at prideofdetroit.com/subscribe.
Be sure to check them out if you haven't already. And I'm sure you're reading these articles because that's part of the reason we have you guys on the show, Jeremy, is because you're not off. Sometimes people aren't reading the bylines like they should. So it's putting a voice or face to the name. But we appreciate you joining us, and we'll look forward to having you guys on as the offseason progresses here.
All right. Anytime, Ryan.
Thanks, Jeremy. Take care.